UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Well, greetings everybody out there across this weird world. I'm delighted to have you watching us tonight. Your eyes do not deceive you. My co-host Jenn Durrell has not transformed into one of my best friends to the south of the state. Jenn is a beautiful woman, but Wayne is a beautiful man. Anyway, I've known tonight's guest going back to the mid 2000s. I was still doing my PhD dissertation in UFO belief, and I'd made this strange little dark fairy tale horror movie, which I'd submitted to a few festivals overseas, including a festival in Wisconsin, which is long before I lived in the North Woods of Wisconsin, a festival called It Came from Lake Michigan Film Festival. The film was accepted, and I believe we even won second place or something like that. Anyway, tonight's guest was the festival director of that festival. He went on to run a number of other festivals. He was a big player in the independent film Wisconsin movement down to the south of me as well. He's written several books. He used to be, I believe, a practicing witch or into Wiccan, which maybe we will or we won't get to. But his current book is right up my alley. It's a book called UFO Cults with the subtitle Watch the Skies, which I just love. So I'm just delighted to welcome to the show my very good friend and the all-round fantastic human being, Wayne Clingman, a.k.a. Mr. Big.
Mr. Big.
Welcome, Wayne.
Welcome. No. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. That's once again talking to my best friend in the world, Dean. There's no better person on this earth I can think of than you, Doctor.
Gee, I need to get you out and get you meeting some more people, but that's very kind. That's very kind of you to say. So we regularly chat on the phone and we talk about all kinds of weird, phenomena, not to mention weird films, not to mention conspiracy type stuff. But I probably have a vague idea, but our listeners don't. What got you into wanting to write a book about UFO cults? Give us a bit of background there.
Easy. My interest in UFO cults comes about because I find the whole subject of UFOs really fascinating. I have no idea what's about, what makes them appear, are they from another planet? Are they from another dimension? Are they time travel? No idea. And then I discovered that people develop faith around UFO cults. Really got me interested. So I took a bit of a dive in that subject. By no means an expert, but a little bit what my taste to let me rant about another one of my favorite subjects when it comes to UFOs. Is you don't have to go very far before you hit rabbit holes.
That's true, and I think the UFO cults lead to many of those rabbit holes. One of my favorite books about UFO cults, not including yours, of course, is Jacques Vallée's classic from the late 70s, Messengers of Deception, which was on UFO cults and contactees. And in there, it's a fascinating book. Like, it's a wonderful time capsule for anybody who wants to source it out and read it, because he actually goes to a meeting of the UFO cult, which became Heaven's Gate. I think back then it was called Human Individuation Metamorphosis or something, HIM it stood for. And that, I think, is when they were still traveling around the country recruiting people, because later on, of course, they stopped recruiting, and then it ended in the terrible mass suicide outside of San Diego, I think, sometime in the late 1990s, after the planet, or after the comet Hale-Bopp made them think that the sources was finally coming to pick them up, or so. That's the popular interpretation of it. But Vallée actually looks at that group. He looks at the early days before the Raelian Society was called the Raelians, I think, or the Raelian Organization, founded by I think he was an ex-race car driver, wasn't he? Claude Virillion, who became Rael. Can you tell us a little bit about the Raelians, and then we'll get back to Vallée's analysis?
Basically, in brief, they're really cool people. I mean, they're pacifistic, their belief system. They absolutely love their cult, their leader, right? They think that he has some communication with aliens, that sort of gig, right? That's typical for most of them. They have the ability of one or a certain number of selected ones can communicate, and they get that information from their head, what's going on with the aliens, what them to do. But I find them unique is that they're very, very pacifistic, very, very, let's work within the system to change the system. They're very much pro-feminism, pro-women's rights. which is very interesting. Any cult at all tends to be very male centric. These people are not. I would like to have drinks with them one day if I was still drink. That interests me, that group of people. I mean, no way matter for are they dangerous anyway, even themselves. Unlike Unfortunate Heaven's Gate, which is kind of like the opposite, which is too bad.
Yeah, it's interesting that those were both cults which were products of the 70s as well. We might talk about some UFO cults that go back to the early Contact D days in a minute. But the fascinating thing about Vallée was he recognized in Messengers of Deception, which might be his most controversial book. It's probably my favorite book of Vallée's. But he suggested that the UFO phenomenon, whatever was at the heart of that, the beliefs around it, including the type of beliefs which were being, I suppose, put out by these organizations, were potentially being manipulated or manufactured or used by potentially some human organization on Earth to work to achieve some type of social change. So I find it interesting when you talked about rabbit holes, because there's one right there. You can start to look at things. You can look at UFO cults, which just seem to be these, whether you're right, whether they seem like the Raelians, which seem fairly pacifistic and harmless, or whether they seem like Heaven's Gate, who I guess were pacifistic and harmless to themselves, but I'm sure that didn't help the family members of left behind of the 30-something suicides. They wouldn't have seemed too harmless. So they're two UFO organizations which went in very different ways. I think the Raelians now, how many are they meant to have, like 100,000 members or something by their own count?
I mean, the guy must be in his 70s. I don't think he's going to be too long in this world. And we'll see what happens to that group once he passes. Anything's possible. We'll just have to keep tracking. I'm sure it'll be in the news. But what fascinates me about, speaking of rabbit holes, and what Mr. Vallée had to say is, it doesn't take much research to run into something called MK Ultra. The fact that the United States government, the CIA, was doing all kinds of really, really obnoxious things to innocent American civilians, see if they can do mind control. Wow. Now that's dangerous and all kinds. I mean, first of all, it's been proven, right? It's not a conspiracy theory, it's been proven. We just don't know who they all did it to, what they all did to these people, but definitely, to include Charles Manson, was one of the people they victimized. Now, Charles Manson wasn't a nice guy, but after he visited the CIA front in California and LA, he became really weird. Did one thing lead to another? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting, these groups, including the UFO cults we mentioned, Heaven's Gate and the Raelians, along with people like Manson, along with people like the science fiction author Philip K. Dick, who had his strange experiences with the Valis or zebra system, which he believed was imparting to him potentially some type of spiritual wisdom. And he vacillates in some of his books whether it was extraterrestrial or whether it was a type of God, or whether it was him being fooled around with by government agencies, potentially even the KGB. And I know in Jim Keith, who was a very famous researcher who died mysteriously after having simple knee surgery. I think he died on the operating table. But I know in a book called Sources of the Illuminati, Jim Keith suggested that a lot of the messages being transmitted to PK Dick seem to have some type of Masonic symbolism. So that's something else to add to it. Are there secret societies involved in some of these, manipulations? Is it a government psyop? Is it some type of organization we can't even pinpoint, the way Vallée suggested in Messages of Deception? So the rabbit holes are endless.
Oh, absolutely. You got even Mr. Keel, when he was looking for the Mothman, was learning all kinds of weird people, all kinds of weird situations that he documented. I mean, to think that somebody took the time to do that to him, and back in the day, somebody went invested a lot of time and a lot of money to screw with a guy. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, there was so many back then too. There seemed to be, as I was saying, it was a strange time. There was all of these weird and wonderful things. You're right, even phenomenologically. Now people see Mothman sightings all over the place now. Like there's Mothman in Chicago. There's Mothman. Jen, my co-host, who actually I didn't mention. I hope she's feeling okay. It seems like she likely has COVID. She's quite unwell. Again, she had it previously, but she just sent me a map today of of Mothman sightings, like that somebody created on, I think, some Google Maps app where people can add their sightings. And there are a bunch of Mothman sightings not far from where she lives in, not that far outside of Kansas City. So they're all over the place. But when Keel was writing Mothman Prophecies, and when you read that book, it does seem to be this very strange, focused event or focused series of phenomena, which ultimately climax in the collapse of the Silver Bridge. So I don't know if things were weirder then, or they weren't weirder then, or the writing was just more interesting then, or people pieced together weirder stories, or we hadn't been, totally culturally contaminated by years of the X-Files and similar science fiction movies. But everything back then has a real fresh, weird scent to it. It's like, what on earth was going on in the 60s and 70s?
Even today, you read, when I read the book Chaos, that talked about Charles Manson, the CIA, and MK Ultra, it's footnoted. You can read the footnotes, and you can hear the author of the book on different podcasts. He talks about the difference between what we're told would happen to Charles Manson and the realities. My God. Again, as I stated before, and I'll say it again, why go through so much trouble? Screw with one or two people. Doesn't make any sense. But they're doing it for a reason. What that reason is beyond me.
Yeah, I think one of the things we often make mistakes with is when we look at something like UFO disinformation, which I'm fascinated about, the idea that the US government or other governments spin UFO stories and UFO tales to suit some purpose, or whole cloth create stories, the way the Paul Benowitz affair of the late 70s into the early 80s, where there was this engineer based outside of Kirtland Air Force Base who believed he was picking up alien messages from and to the base and thought he was seeing flying saucers, and he was a good patriot, so he reported it to the base. And then the security forces of the Air Force Base decided to go into overdrive to spin him away from the real technology being tested there, and just increased his belief in UFOs and alien communications, and fed him all kinds of baloney and staged things that looked like they were real underground bases at Dulce, New Mexico, and gave him computers to interpret extraterrestrial messages and told him, yes, we know, thank you for reporting it to us, we know it's happening. And the thing is, you can look at that and you can go, okay, well, that makes sense. They just wanted to throw Benowitz off the trail. But the end result of that spin that came out of there, not to mention there was an awful lot of weird cattle mutilations in the Dulce area as well, but the weird spin that came out of that story and then spiraled into things like the MJ-12 documents, which the same people at the heart of that kind of intelligence cabal probably spread as well, along with Roswell, along with almost everything that is at the heart of what I call X-Files UFO belief, because everybody understands what that means, that type of, conspiracy from Roswell onwards with crash sources and deals with aliens and the US government and underground bases. Almost all of that comes out of the Benowitz affair and things happening around that time. And you can pinpoint about 5 people. Like, you can literally go, okay, well, Richard Doty was involved, William Moore was involved. There's rumors even in Adam Go-Rightly's wonderful book. I always get the title wrong. I think it's Spooks, Kooks, and Saucers. But he states in that book that he was told, he was told a number of things. One of the things was William Moore, who's the guy who co-wrote the original Roswell book and was involved in the Benowitz, I suppose, psyop, said, we created the term greys. When we talk about aliens as greys, they created that. And when we think about Hynek as being, I suppose, this, and he was obviously an important figure, but when we think about him being a definite good guy after the Connon Committee and with QFOS and everything out being there front and center to get at UFO truth, in that book it says he's the person who gave Benowitz the computer that was feeding him supposedly, which was meant to be interpreting alien messages, but which was just them feeding him weird alien messages. So again, rabbit holes. You can't look at UFO belief and follow it very far and not start to question the basic tenets. And then you start to question, why are these tenets being spat out? And you're the guest and I'm just rambling, but I'll stop. But my point from this very long story was, we don't know what those psyops are often for. Are they for just to throw maybe they're to throw somebody off the scent. Maybe they're to test, is there a mole somewhere who gives the information of the Soviets? Maybe it's to test how the UFO community will react. Maybe, like Valet suggested, some of this is to shape human belief. I don't know. And there's no way I can know, but
Right.
we shouldn't jump to conclusions on what the reason of these things are, I don't think.
And that scares the hell out of me because, again, somebody's spending an awful lot of time, an awful lot of resources to manipulate people to do act certain ways. And that's not, my opinion, not the country I thought we lived in, which is, again, a scary rabbit hole.
Well, I don't think you can talk about the modern UFO phenomenon, and certainly not UFO belief, without placing in the context of the national security state, which rises up after World War II. Like the year of the Roswell crash, the year of the very first flying saucer sighting, when Kenneth Arnold, saw something which headline writers mistermed as flying saucers. Well, he just said they moved like flying saucers would if they saucers would if you skipped them across water. I guess like if you skipped a stone, like I was doing at the beach the other day here, the lake beach. That is how he described them, then became flying saucers. Anyway, all of that aside, 1947 is the same year that most of the machinations, that's not, machinations is unfair. Most of the machinery of the modern intelligence system or modern intelligent establishment was actually rolled out. Like the first, I think, National Security Act was signed in 1947. I think you get the CIA emerging. You get all of this type of new apparatus. And that's the same time flying saucers explode into the American consciousness and then the world's popular consciousness. So you can't even understand them without understanding this relationship with the new secret, I suppose a deep state, as somebody would say.
Call it. Even we go back to the 1890s when people see an airship, nobody, to my understanding, I'm no expert, but nobody who reported those airships had anything remotely what happened to John Keel and others. They just reported it and people went on their way.
It's interesting because, of course, the airship flaps of 1896 into 1897, there isn't a lot of follow-up the way we might get with UFO researchers, hunting down people who reported UFO events. Secondly, I wonder how hungry somebody was if they had a weird experience after seeing the great airship, because as we know, a lot of UFO witnesses, along with a lot of witnesses of any type of anomalous phenomenon, often go on to have other strange experiences. So you see a UFO, you might get poltergeist activity at your house, or you might see a Bigfoot the next weekend. Now, these are some of the more, the more fringier examples, but there's a lot of them, and it starts to build a picture that a lot of this stuff is related. The other problem with the 1896, 1897 airship flap is, as you well know, there was a lot of yellow journalism back then. There's a lot of yellow journalism now. We just call it fake news, right? But back then, reporters would create stories to get readers. So if there was a story of the airship and people were excited, well, we'll say Farmer Joe saw an airship, just outside of town, and it would be the headline. So it's sometimes difficult to interpret what was real, what wasn't real. Certainly, the irony is in that airship flap, there's a lot of the precursors of the modern UFO phenomenon, which were probably hoaxes then, like an airship crashes and there's a dead alien supposedly buried in, I think, Aurora, Texas in 1897. And there's also the story of an airship getting caught rustling cattle. It's the same way we have cattle mutilators today. But I think that they're the stories that are likely hoaxes, but it's weird that those stories reemerge in the phenomenon, 50 plus years later. I mean, what the devil's going on?
Well, what's funny to me is now you have podcasts and somewhat TV shows where people go and look for the alien that's buried in a graveyard in Texas. Of course, they don't find it, but they find something else, right? So they can leave you with that mystery, right? And I'm sorry. I mean, it's good for entertainment, right? I get the entertainment aspect of it, but I'm really tired of podcasters coming up with bullshit to get viewers or downloads. I mean, I listened to one the other day on Roswell. The guy said there were dead alien bodies and they were doing autopsies in that town. And it's like, you get crazier the more you listen to it. It's like, how can you listen to this shit? But, they get downloads, and today there's probably 50, 60 people say, my God, in Roswell, they had dead alien bodies at the autopsies at Chief's police homes. So, yeah, you hear it and people believe it.
Sure. Let's jump back to UFO cults for just a little bit. The other, I think we've already talked about the Raelians, and we've talked about Heaven's Gate, which are two of the better known for different reasons. Of course, the Raelians became quite controversial and grabbed news attention back. I believe it was in the late, no, it wasn't late 90s. It was probably mid 2000s, actually, sometime in that window anyway, where they came forward claiming they had the technology to clone a human being. So they became front and center in a lot of news cycles. Can you remember when that became a big deal? I think it was about the mid 2000s when that story.
The sheep was talked about, wasn't it?
I think that was a mainstream one, and then the Raelians came out and said, we've got technology. So they kind of jumped into this kind of cloning debate at the time, and that organization got an awful lot of attention. Now, I haven't followed. I'm guessing, well, not that you should necessarily trust it. Well, I never heard from the media, so it must never have happened. That's a pretty naive way of looking at the world. But my point is, I think if the Raelians had actually cloned somebody and announced it, we all would have heard by now. So that story just seemed to peter away. I haven't tracked it at all. Do you know what ended up happening with the clone story?
Off the face. I think this went away when nobody's paying attention to him. I mean, how do these organizations gain more people? Have to claim things. If an organization doesn't grow, it dies. Mm-hmm. So they have to do something to gain membership, or at least gain people, write them a check or buy a book.
Oh, I'm sure it drove people to the Raelians because they had international news about them because of that claim. Most UFO cults stay fairly small. Like we talked about Heaven's Gate, but I spent there's a couple of interesting ones from the 50s, which are still around. Noticeably, Aetherius and the Unarious Academy of Science. Well, I guess we can look at the Unarious Academy of Science. I've spent time with both of them, but I spent more time with the Unarious Academy of Science back in 1999 when I was doing my doctoral dissertation. I don't know what that means. There was thunder right above me. Maybe I shouldn't be talking about the Unarians. They've sent the Space Brothers to curse me. I'm joking. Anyway, the Unarians were also what I found essentially harmless. They reminded me, I spent time with them. I went to, I think, a meeting at their actual, I guess, their main organization place. And then I also went to what was their, I think, their Conclave of Light, it's called, which was it takes place once a year on this large piece of land that they own outside of El Cajon, California, essentially in the desert. There's a very big property which they bought so the flying saucers could land. And initially in 1999, their cosmology said that 33 saucers were going to land on top of each other like this giant pancake stack. So that's why I originally wanted to go there in 99. I believe that was the year. Anyway, they'd already, I think, wound back that prophecy by then. And at the time, I suppose, cult leader, for lack of a better term, was Louis Spiegel, who the Unarians called, I think there's hail hitting my window above, if anybody can hear tapping. The Unarians called Antares, and he was actually the third leader of that organization. The first was Ernest Norman, who with his wife Ruth Norman founded the organization in the 1950s after, I believe, Ernest Norman had UFO contacts, much like a lot of people like George Adamski and the like had contacts. And then he passed in 71. And then his wife, Ruth, took over the organization. And she was supposedly the reincarnated. Oh, my goodness. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
Okay, hang on. Do you know very much about the Unarians? This has never ever happened during a show before. That's very weird. It's actually
I think it's a single from the Space Aliens, Dean.
While I change that, just tell everybody. It normally doesn't happen because it's actually powered in. I don't know what happened. Can you tell everybody while I change that, just something about your book? Like, just chat for about a minute. I'm just going to fix that. I won't be able to hear you for a second while I fix it either.
I appreciate Dean inviting me on the show to talk my book. If you find my book, you can find all my books under my name on Amazon, which is Wayne Clingman with a C, Clingman. Again, that's Wayne Clingman, Clingman. I have books on the Mafia, books on the UFO, as Dean and I talked about. I have books. I have a couple of fiction books. I have all kinds of books. We got an interesting one that I was on the show before about the history of the Ohio Valley in the 18 and 1700s. It was not a particularly good place to go. Some people, in fact, were kidnapped by pirates, and some were even eaten. It was not a good place to go. Most people don't know about it. Check out the book.
Still here. I'm just fixing it. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Wayne, keep telling your time.
Talk about the check out the book Dark River. I mean, fascinating stuff to say the least. Also wrote one recently about the mafia in Hollywood, with the idea we took basically bad people, went to Hollywood and did bad things with weak old people. I mean, it's incredible what people will do, get that fame and fortune. But the idea with UFO cults and the rabbit holes I've been talking to Dean about is I went to now, because I'm fascinated by the rabbit hole idea, is what Dean talked about earlier, is look at some of the early incidences with UFOs and how they evolved into not only what happened to the researchers, but the idea that the men in black became like sick thieves. It was like the thing to do. If you saw a UFO, you probably had some type of incident with men in black. It's wild stuff. And myself and my co-writer for that project, Shasta, we'll be looking into some more weird things around the time of the Murray Island incident and talking about what happened with them, that situation, what happened to some researchers afterwards, and looking at that from that aspect, kind of more broaden my base from there. But Dean's back, and he fixed its technical problems.
All I can say is I'm so glad that you were my guest tonight, because I could just throw it to you and say, Wayne, just talk. That's never happened to me. My camera's never once failed on this show. I've had other tech failures, never a camera failure.
It happens.
So there you go. So I heard you talking about your new book, which is super exciting. I don't know an awful lot about it, but I know that it is going to look at a little bit at Maury Island that you mentioned.
What we're working on now is more, and the thing that gets me, and probably can go in a little bit more detail, because with the start of that research project, it will be a much longer book than UFO Cult. UFO Cult is perfect for an afternoon. When you get a little bit of information, by all means, get UFO Cults and get that little bit of an hour, 2 hour worth of a read, right? Something to do, reading sitting in a hammock and getting there with a Kindle, right? But the next book, we'll certainly look at Murray Allen, seriously look at some of the people involved with it, some of the people what happened to them, which is absolutely fascinating. Take a look at Dr. Hynek. And it's not, the man's dead. I don't want to go and disparage the dead necessarily, but he's not Mr. Clean Cut. I mean, he goes back in the deep state himself, because he's part of it. He was not a sitting member of the Robinson panel, but he was associated with them. He knew what they wanted, meaning the Robinson panel, was trying to do, was suppressing UFO information. He knew what they wanted him to do as well. So to say he was out there trying to go and give us the straight facts, to me, is bullshit.
Well, just the people who don't know what the Robinson panel is, do you want to fill them in a little bit about?
Sure. After Robinson panel came out after the Second World War, when something called Foo Fighters, FOO, was reported. They were reported in the European Theater War, they reported in the Pacific Theater War. What they were, the airplanes were basically flying around doing their thing, and we see most times they were described as giant balls of light, like ball lightning, right? But some of it wasn't that so much that, but then they started following the planes would maneuver, and the balls of lightning would follow them around there. Some incidents report where pilots say, especially in the B-29s, the balls of lightning would come inside the cockpits and go up and down the fuselage. That's not more than one pilot reported this scenario. It wasn't one guy had too much to drink at the PX club and decided to make up a story. Something was going on. The Robinson panel looked into what was going on because they wanted to know too. Because people were concerned. A lot of people, Air Force veterans, Army veterans, want to know what the hell they're seeing. I can't blame them any. They want to know what's going on. The Robinson panel decided that the best way to go and handle the situation versus look into the truth, find out what was going on, is say, let's suppress the information. Because people really don't need to know. They can trust us. We're the government.
Yeah, you're right. The official position, of course, was that the Robertson panel didn't think there was a national security issue with UFO sightings. And they were concerned that during a time of war with, say, the Soviets, or during a time of crisis, maybe UFO reports could be manipulated or used by the enemy potentially, or just occur, whatever, which would tie up so much communication that it might be difficult for real communication to get through. So you're right. The decision was, let's have a public education campaign that downplays the significance of UFO sightings. And there's certainly a long history of that, because if we go then, through, like we were talking about Hynek's time with Blue Book, and then we move into the Condon Committee. Hynek himself, although supposedly that was his kind of come to Jesus moment, when under pressure to explain a UFO flap in Michigan, he said, well, some of the sightings might have been swamp gas or marsh gas.
Yeah,
And that caused national headlines or international headlines. And people who'd seen it, were like, this is ridiculous. There's no way that was marsh gas. And lots of people saw it. And then because of that, there was considerable congressional pressure. Ironically, that's probably what triggered it initially, to hand the study of UFOs from the Air Force to supposedly an independent body, which was the University of Colorado UFO study, headed by one of the leading physicists of the day, Edward Condon. And this was just determined, I think, in about 1966. And to do this study on UFOs and to see if there really was anything there. And the Condon Committee had many flaws, and one of the most public flaws was something called the Lowe memo, where one of the senior staffers called Lowe leaked, or he didn't leak, he wrote an internal memo which said the trick for this study would be for us to present to the American public like we were a totally objective scientific organization or scientific study looking at UFOs completely objectively, while to somehow at the same time kind of nod, wink to the rest of our friends in the scientific establishment around the world and let them know we really had absolutely zero hopes of finding anything remotely anomalous when it came to it. And that was leaked initially, I think, to James McDonald, who was one of the premier UFO investigators or ufologists in the country. And then it got further leaked out from there. And then essentially the entire UFO community turned their back on Condon. But when the Condon report was finally announced I think it was given to the airport in late 68 and then was published in 69. By then, almost the entire UFO community or anybody paying attention already knew what was coming. And sure enough, the conclusion for the Condon report, at least it's a massive tome, the conclusion written by Edward Condon was there's nothing here which is of any interest to national security, so essentially the Air Force could wash its hands of the whole thing.
No. There's a webpage called The Black Vault, which I highly recommend for people interested in not only UFOs but national security subjects. Whole nine yards is very fascinating stuff. He collects Freedom of Information Act requests. He submits them all the time, all kinds of questions. He puts them on his website. It's free to use. I would take the opportunity to dig into some of the things like the Condon report. Some of the scientists that we mentioned, see what Freedom of Information Act requests have produced, what they said, their backgrounds, and interconnections, because most of these people are interconnected. It's kind of scary to think of that. And the media doesn't really pick up on that, at least so far.
What did you think of the recent hearings in Washington about, did you have a takeaway or any impressions of that? Or
I do. My opinion, it's just an interesting way to gain some time. The question I have is there something out there? I have no idea. But having one government agency after another government agency come up with things and then kind of basically lie, does give me any faith in the government, which is kind of lacking to begin with. But also makes me think, what is going on out there that are scared of us to find out? I mean, it would be perfectly okay if they come out and say, we don't know what's going on either, but let's look into it. And we got all kinds of, we got this, we got that, we got all kinds of people look into it, all kinds of technology to use, look into it. I'd be happy with that situation. I'd be exactly pleased versus lying about it.
Well, supposedly too. I know this week. I think I haven't followed the story that much. I've been busy, and I need to really jump on top of it and pay a bit more attention this week. But I know the Pentagon just announced also some new department or new group which is going to look into these studies. Is there any insight you can give us on that? Or
this got done saying I think that's nothing more than a way to blow off steam, get us confused. Look at the pretty thing. Look at the shiny. Look at the shiny. Look at the shiny. Oh, no, it's monkeypox. Look at the shiny. They're going to keep us busy. They're going to keep us engaged in other ways. They don't want the public to ask the questions, which is too bad, which is frustrating because members of the public have a right to the information. I want to be able to, not so much as Mulder would say, I want to believe, but I just don't want to know. I want to know that somebody, even if the government would say, we know what's going on, but we're going to look into it, I could believe when they said that. It would make me ecstatically happy.
When I hear any type of government disclosure, or well, there hasn't been any disclosure, but any hints of government disclosure, I always suspect that why would anybody who's been suspicious of the government's involvement with the UFO phenomenon since the 1947s or earlier, as you were saying, back to the Foo Fighters or Jacques Vallée's most recent book, Trinity, the best kept secret about a supposed UFO crash in 1945, why would anybody think that a government that has, if that's what they believe, that the government has been lying, has known about UFOs properly, like had physical sources in their hands, which is the popular mythology, has been lying since the mid-40s. Why would anybody expect all of a sudden for what the government tells you to be true? Now, I think it's the scary thing is I think a lot of people just want to hear the government tell them what they already believe. So if the government came out tomorrow and said to somebody who already believed in that type of UFO X-Files belief system, said, yes, we had a saucer in 1947. It was extraterrestrial, we believe. We had a couple dead aliens, and we had a live one that we interrogated, and we back-engineered sources, and we've talked to the aliens since. Great swaths of the UFO public or UFO community would believe them because it's already what they believe. It would just be this self-fulfilling, oh, well, but why would you trust why would you trust an arm of, why would you trust this government that you haven't trusted for 80 years? I don't understand.
What would you, the thing is that when we don't trust our government, it's scary because our government to work needs the public to trust them. And when we find out there's a difference between a mistake, right? I can be pulled over by a cop who thinks I'm speeding. That could be a mistake. That's a mistake. Mistakes happen. Covering up data for vaccines is not a mistake. They did that on purpose, right? Why? Tell me why, right? Because the more you say it didn't happen, and the more facts come out that says it does. And now you're gonna tell me I have to worry about this too? I don't.
It's problematic when you have government become the size that it's become, and it's so compartmentalized, of course, as well. So even when somebody rolls out in the DOD saying one thing, I have no reason to believe that they know what another component of the US military is actually doing. If there's some black budget operation somewhere, I don't know. How do I know if some DOD spokesman has any idea about that black budget operation? And incidentally, in fairness to the Robertson panel that we were talking about before, and in fairness to some of this spin, some of it I totally get. Some of it, if you're in a Cold War with the Soviets, you have to really mitigate. Yes. What happens if the American public can get tricked by some fake UFO event by the Soviets and go crazy? Some of it you have to also, or at least I understand, if there's genuine secret technology that you don't want your enemies internationally to get a hold of, you go, well, if we spin this as a UFO thing, everybody's just going to think it's BS anyway, so let's spin it. Some of it I get. I also think that there's a clash there with the idea of a Republican type of democracy. How do you, and this is something, and I'm sure you'll have some insight, but how do you strike that balance between protecting the type of national security secrets which have to be protected, but also, I suppose, being open to releasing information that isn't national security orientated,
I wish I knew the answer to that. I do know this. I get the idea with B-2 bombers flying out of Area 51, right? People misidentify as flying out a subject. They can say, no, it's not that. It's a new stealth bomber. That was not going to happen, right? But that's far different than that situation than giving John Keel a hard time in West Virginia. It's far different in that situation than some of the things they do to other researchers.
Well, here comes the question then, and Keel would, I'm sure, ask you this question too if he was still around. Was Keel, with the things giving Keel a hard time, not the US government? Were the things playing around with Keel something paraphysical, or were they some other human agency, the way Valet suggests in Messengers of Deception, which in fairness to Valet is about, several books ago now, so it mightn't be his position anymore anyway. But my point is then it becomes a question of what was giving people away. Were the men in black really the US government? Now I've heard plenty of arguments that yes, it was, but I've also heard arguments that to me seem that whatever those things or those agents or those men in black were mightn't have been human, mightn't have been US government.
The stuff that Jack Keel ran into in West Virginia were agents of the American government for whatever reason.
That's interesting.
Other things, not so much. I mean, we talk about Mr. Valet, right? We talked about that guy, I think it was in Spain, that had an incident happen. Then he traces all the way to Brazil, and structures were built. Letterhead was made. Corporations were developed, right? It was listed. They existed, right? They didn't do anything, but they're in paper. That took effort. That took money. Somebody more than you and I, more than some guy who had a desk, had to make those decisions. Why? It doesn't make any sense. Lots of things in life that doesn't have to make sense, right? But usually they do. Does that make any sense? Probably doesn't make any sense itself.
There's another lesser known or lesser read Valet book, because I think it's been out of print since it came out. And it cost an inordinate amount of money to even get a paperback. I think I got one recently for a decent price, but normally it's, even a paperback, I think is $100 or more. And that's a book called Edge of Reality, where it's essentially a conversation between him and Hynek and I think somebody else. And one of the things he puts forward in that book, just in regards to what you're talking about now regarding, does it make any sense? Who are these people? He was one of and it's just a throwaway thing. It's like on one page. And because Valet's throwing out these ideas, as Valet, particularly in his prime, was like a machine. Like he was, he was really capable of molding these, different interpretations. And one of the things he said is, well, what if all these kind of, silly secret societies and silly, Satanists at the Church of Satan, and I don't even know if this is the terminology he uses, but what if all these occult groups, which we kind of think of as not influential, it's just kind of hobbyists, like you've joked to me about Wiccans in the past, right? What if there was an alternative occult stream that was super secret and had been around for a long time and wasn't, what I mean? Wasn't just hedonists in the woods wanting to, maybe with some genuine religious feeling, but as you've joked to me before, just wanting to, get drunk or high and party and have fun, right? What if there was a genuine occult underground going all the way back to the type of, Rosicrucian flares of the past, or all the way back through the Illuminati or coming forward through the Illuminati scares of the 18th century? What if there was some organization that was not the government, was something else, and had somehow kept this weird integrity? That doesn't mean they're right about their beliefs. It just means they have this internal power structure and they can do things.
And it's just you bring them up. Have you read the book by Robert Anton Wilson called Illuminati?
I read there's the trilogy. There's the Illuminatus trilogy, and then there's Cosmic Trigger, the final secret of the Illuminati. But yeah, I read the Illuminatus stuff years ago. I have a copy of Cosmic Trigger here. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating. He kind of drifts into that a bit. I think it's a fascinating book. Even Aleister Crowley, talks about some of that stuff, and he goes, and that gets really weird in Heartbeat. Crowley, what he was doing with different people, who he was all involved with.
Well, imagine if you and I had been around, I don't know, and we had some money and we had some influence and some other buddies, I don't know, prior to the Age of Revolution, like back in the first part of the 18th century. And we were like, we're going to go out there and, we're going to push out some ideas gradually and slowly, because we genuinely believe in these things, right? And we attracted other people because we were men of influence and power back then. Not that either of us are now, but let's imagine back then we were. And we were like, we're keeping this under wraps though. And you have this long-ranging plan. And this sounds super conspiratorial, but I don't think it's that silly an idea. I don't think it's that ridiculous to think this.
And if you look at, sometimes people can accuse bankers of that thought. That bankers are running the world because bankers have whatever agenda, and they want us to follow that agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And the banking families, such as Rothschilds and others, Rockefellers and others, right, have an agenda. They know what that agenda is going to be, and they know what's going to happen today, tomorrow, next week, next year, because they can make it happen. They have the power. You look at some of the families, banking families, and mind you, I think some of the attacks in the Rothschilds is nothing more than anti-Semitism, which is
I agree.
Like no tomorrow. But they might have a point in some of this other stuff, right?
But yeah, imagine if, again, taking us back to the back to the first half of the 18th century. Imagine if we became buddies with a banking family and we convinced some of their sons that our cult vision of the world was correct and we had all of these funds to do things with. But we didn't come out, and I'm not, let's just leave the banking stuff aside. Just imagine that a genuine occult organization like Vallée threw away as a thought. It's a great idea. And it kind of pops up a little in Messengers of Deception as well as a couple of his other books. But I think the best articulation is briefly in Edge of Reality. What if that actually went on? I mean, it's fascinating to think if there was a genuine secret occult tradition. They might be wrong. Everything they believe in, their cosmology, their belief system might be madness, but they stayed underground and exerted influence. It's fascinating to think.
Going right, we're not keeping up, because once we get that going, we get our sons involved, our grandsons involved. It goes on, it spins, it spins, it spins. And once our families are the height of these powers at some, whatever power they have, they want to keep that power, they want to keep that influence. So that's what we do. And when people become too close, when people become dangerous, we get rid of them. We have our agents slip something in our coffee. We have our agents give them a computer that will make them think that they're talking from aliens on another planet.
Well, there you go.
Yeah,
that's the thing. How much his modern belief system is directed, and that again, it's something which isn't talked about very much in ufology. But I think the greatest elder statesman today, Jacques Vallée, although I think his book Trinity, I don't agree with hardly anything in that. I think that book is he likes to flex different ideas, I guess. But I think that book's problematic. But I think that. It's weird that these ideas were thrown out by Vallée and ufology hasn't picked them up properly. But ufology's kind of picked up other ideas. Oh, maybe it's interdimensional, or maybe it isn't extraterrestrial, but they haven't picked up. What if this is all some kind of mechanism playing with us, and there's actually a human agency that's pulling the strings?
What if there's a human agency pulling the string? That's a very interesting idea. It would make a lot of sense. It would make a lot of sense why sometimes. I'm going to use the government again. The government does things that don't make any sense because they're not obeying what the voters want, but they're obeying what this outside power wants them to do.
Possibly. That's that. And you know what? You could certainly have people in an organization like that eventually become involved in government, but also if what Vallée suggested is almost like, it could almost be thought of as a breakaway civilization. It could almost be thought of as an alternative power structure that had its eye on a long game prize for so long.
It makes sense too. See how suddenly things automatically change. The 60s, things change in heartbeat. We're seeing interesting changes now. Will they stick? I don't know. And then again, look at companies like Disney and other mass media companies who've been working for the government well before the Second World War. And look at the power that media has to get us to think what they want us to think, right?
Yeah, there's certainly the idea that Disney, well, it's not even the idea, it's the reality that Disney was making, propaganda films and, perpetuating various ideas of the military power structure in America going back to, you're right, into the 40s. And who knows how those relationships have developed.
Well, to me, and this is kind of all the deep end, but I'm willing to go in here. When you think what we know by reading the papers that we do, I mean, I don't mean any weird ideas. We have people involved in media companies now that have really stupid things and done really horrible things to children, right? And they're in jail. I'm sorry. When did that happen? When I was a young man, because I'm an old guy now, right? When I was in my 30s, they'd be in prison. No doubt about it, they'd be in prison. But now they're walking the streets. I can't. I don't know if everybody else can't hear Dean or not, but I can't hear Dean.
Oh, I'm glad you told me. No, I was just saying that. Thank you for telling me. There must have been. Is it working now? Can you hear me now? Okay, that's good. No, I was just saying, as far as the type of trafficking you're talking about, it's interesting that both Epstein and Maxwell got taken down. But I constantly see Facebook posts. I don't see the mainstream media talking about it. But why aren't there clients of these rich and powerful people that they were trafficking to being brought to justice as well? It's very strange. But see, here's the thing: we can go even more out on the limb here than with our UFO cult stuff. It becomes even stranger, and we just go down even more rabbit holes. It never ends.
I mean, there's no such thing as one rabbit hole we can go to. There's rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole. And the one thing I'm fascinated by is because we live where we live, even though the problems of the country, because I have a high-speed internet connection, right? I can look at everything I want to look at. I can get all kinds of documents I want to look at, right? I have the ability to write whatever I write, put it out in the marketplace for people to decide they want to buy it, or am I too batshit crazy? It's up to them, right? The idea is making sure people know how to read, more people know how to write, and to do simple math. The world can be their oyster. It's when those things are controlled is when we have problems.
Now I'm going to drag us back to UFO cults again. Is there much that you know about the Aetherius organization or the Aetherians?
I was circling on Epstein. I apologize.
Yeah, George King was a contactee in the 1950s.
That's right. That's right.
And now there's still the organization, the Aetherius Society, or the Aetherians, and I spent a little time with them also in '99. And one of the things they do, which is fascinating, is they channel spiritual energy into these, essentially they're batteries. They do this big chanting, I can't even do it. I've been to one. And then somebody at the front puts their hand, and towards the camera, towards the battery, and projects the energy from everybody chanting. And I went to one of those when I was doing my dissertation as well, and spent some time talking to people at Aetherius in their Los Angeles headquarters, which I think is their main headquarters. George King was an Englishman, but he took it to LA. So much of the occult scene in the 1950s ran out of California. We can get to that, as we were talking about before, even into the 60s and into the 70s. But it's interesting because when I was at the Unarious Academy of Science, it just felt like I remember a few years before that, I'd been dating a girl who was in an amateur musical society in Sydney, and they'd have meetings and they'd say, okay, this weekend we're cleaning the hall. And when I went to a Unarious meeting and when I went to the Unarious Conclave of Light, it felt like that. It felt like an amateur musical society. People who like to dress up and, reenact past lives, although an amateur musical society is, of course, doing My Fair Lady or something, or Flower Drum Song or Camelot or something instead. But it had the same vibe. It felt literally completely harmless. I don't want to say silly because that's unfair, but it almost felt like just people with a hobby. When I was with the Aetherians and they were chanting, there was a genuine, and I'm not a kumbaya person, as you know, but there was a genuine energy in that room. Like that chanting evoked something, and I didn't feel uncomfortable for a second when I was with the Unarians. But when I was at Aetherius, I felt a spiritual power, and not a good one. And I'm not saying that to be derogatory to that organization, but I felt uncomfortable. I felt like there was a genuine spiritual presence which didn't ring well with me. And I'm not somebody who walks around feeling presences. I'm not like my normal co-host Jen, who feels this stuff. But that organization felt like it was actually doing something spiritual that was connecting with something else. Let's put it that way.
A circle.
Oh, tell us a little bit about that from your Wiccan days.
We do circles, right? The new moons and the full moons, right? And we do the circle, we gather the circles, we chant and things, and you could see different things. But how much did we see, like making the flames go higher and the like? How much of it was really going on versus how much we want to see, right? But you could see different things. You definitely felt that power. You definitely felt that energy. And I suspect that, are you familiar with a psychic vampire is?
No, tell me about this.
Psychic vampire is an individual who feeds off the energy of other people.
A psychic vampire. Gotcha.
Right. I mean, psychic vampires were thick as flies because they had all that energy to feed from. A lot of weak-willed people, a lot of weak no offense that's really meant. There's a lot of weak-willed women that want to be the movie star, that want to be the princess in a Disney film, but at 400 pounds, it's not going to happen. But the guy will make them feel like, oh, we don't care that you're 400 pounds. We don't care that you have 15 heads and what else may be going on. You're beautiful with me because they can have sex with them, because they get with them and take their money. I think when I was involved in the Wicked community, in the area I was involved in, there's a lot of Canmen in the situation. And what only ended that was AIDS showed up. I mean, AIDS was hell in the Wicked community because a lot of people did not believe in safe sex.
And what period were you involved about?
I was there probably I was active between 83 and say 90.
Gosh, yeah, and so 83 was in those early days of AIDS. You're right. Goodness gracious.
It hit big time by about 80, around the time of the divorce, 86, 87. I mean, people just dropped like flies. Not that I wish any harm on people, but to me, I mean, safe sex was stopped a lot of the pain and suffering that people felt, right? But again, you can't have people live off from other people the way that was done. You can't. I mean, as we discussed in my book, I mentioned the fact that you could join the group. The weekends you can do work parties, and the weekends you can do different things, right? You don't want to buy the newsletter, they want you to buy the book, they want you to take the classes. And if you didn't have a job, well, that meant you could do things at the farm, you could do things at the bookstore. And of course, you won't need to be paid because you're doing it for the faith, right?
Was it like a coven or something? I don't know very much about the practicing.
More than 13 members were the coven. I mean, people do. It's like any other thing. It's like UFO religions. It's like anything. You can find people who will do anything it takes to be in that position of power, to be that person. It was incredible to watch.
What made you leave? What made you leave that organization?
Divorced.
So I'm sorry, I talked over you. Said you divorced, though. I think.
No, divorced. I mean, my ex-wife and I were not getting along very well at all, and the divorce kind of made me get away from there, which is probably the best thing. If my alcoholism did me any favors, it was helping me get out of Wicca. Not that I think I would have done some of the other stuff, but I'm a lot better out without it.
You were raised as a Christian, though, is that right? Or
I was.
Was it? Did you find that conflicting when you were?
No. You ever read a person by the name of Starhawk?
So what was that?
Called Starhawk?
No.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't say that as a conflicting at all. No. I'm pretty eclectic in my beliefs, even though I'm a good Catholic, right? I mean, again, at the time when I joined, I was out of the Army. I was a heavy drinker, right? And I saw a guy with two girls in the bar in Madison. There's a guy with two girls on the couch. He was making out with them, right? I was drunk, right? I said, gee, it'd be nice to have two girls at the same time, right? He got it. I could get them too, right? So they invited me to a May Day celebration. We had a circle and drew up energy, and then they had cakes and wine afterwards. The next day, they did something else that was that too. Within a month, well, I was thick as flies with them.
Did you ever see anything supernatural? Like, what kind of stuff did you see when you were involved?
I would say the worst thing I saw was drunks and people high. I saw a lot of that. I didn't see much else that I would say would be supernatural. I'll tell you, I did see. I would swear in a stack of Bibles that everybody that got into Wicca, instead of read out their holy books, usually started having bad things happen, usually with fire, apartment fires, home fires.
Huh.
I'm not quite sure why. I know he wrote a book. I think by that title, his first work, but the people involved in ceremonial magic think you should read. I'm not taking him in that be a good thing. I mean, Aleister Crowley was not a good person. I think many of the things that he looked into, his magical beliefs, as we know with Robert Parsons, was not good for people.
Yeah, you have to wonder if there's a reality to some of this. When some doors are open, like I know Crowley, for example, tried to have, what is it, a moonchild or something, tried to bring something down. What happens when you do these rituals? I know also that Crowley, one of his homes was on the banks of Loch Ness, and I've heard theories that might be behind certain Loch Ness monster apparitions as well. It's so strange. All this stuff's interconnected in a very weird way.
up in Scotland caught fire a number of times. Even when he was no longer living, and I think Robert Plant owned it, caught fire once. But again, I mean, what usually would happen is that there was a call for something, like people needed jobs. So the work was to call up energy to help Wayne get a job, or help Susan get a job. Or maybe Sam was having a problem with alcoholism and was trying to quit this time. They were trying to help Sam out, right? Was everybody there worth, I don't want to use that word, was everybody there have problems? Not at all. Were there a number of people there with issues? Yes, they were. The problem that many people have is being able to tell the difference. And I cannot tell you the number of young girls there over the age of 18 that were victimized by men. Yeah. Honey, I'll make you feel better because I know I can see the guy that's in you. I don't need to use a condom because, well, I have the ability to control my output. And when they got pregnant, well, the guy just wanted you to have this child. Of course, they disappear.
I think that's the danger of any organization where people have power over other people. It lets it lets all kinds of base instincts bubble out, and it also attracts people who want to have power over other people, not just in religious organizations, but in all kinds of organizations where people have power over other people.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is since this is not a governing body per se, if you have a problem, you can't call up the governing. I mean, if I went to the Catholic Church tomorrow, the Mass, right, and something bad happened, I can do something. It's people I can talk to. You know, if something would happen to me at a Wiccan ceremony, who can I talk to? No one. You know, I mean, you can talk to the other members. That's something may or may not happen, but it's easy to just shut your mouth and move on. Not that I'm going to say if people want to explore Wicca, by all means, they should do so. But at the same time, they should go in there with open our eyes, observe what's going on, make their own decisions.
Well, I suppose that probably applies to some of the UFO religious organizations we're talking about as well. Like, I know the Raelians have a reputation of as a, I don't want to say sex cult because they're strong words, but I certainly know those type of terms have been thrown around, particularly back in the day when, there was photos circulated of, topless, members or naked members in fields and bunches of them, and almost Woodstock type events, and the idea of free love and everything else. And again, no value judgment on these things, but you have to imagine there are, in that type of environment, it might draw. I'm sure it does draw people with wicked intentions or with not good intentions. And how's that policed? I don't know how the Raelians are policed. Like, I don't know if there's an internal. I mean, I'm aware. I know a bit about the organization, but I don't know if there's any suggestion of sexual misconduct in an organization which says love is the only rule. I mean, that's literally what Rael says. Love is the only rule. How's that policed? I don't know.
No, I mean, that's with any organization. You can have somebody with power say this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
If you don't do what I want you to do, if you don't believe, you have to go. If you want to stay in the organization, because it means that much to you, you do it. We see that happen all the time.
Well, heavens, I feel like I'm Jim Moseley now, the late, great Jim Moseley, who used to love to talk about sex and saucers, who used to like to see the salaciousness. I met Moseley before he died in Clearwater, and he was a blast. For those who don't know, he was, along with Graybarker, he hoaxed George Adamski, and he ran Saucer Smear, which was essentially, I don't know, the National Enquirer of the UFO world. That was just about all the gossip. It was so great. I miss Moseley. But Moseley was always interested in the sex and saucer angle. And one of the saddest stories there, of course, is that Heaven's Gate believed that at the next level you were sexless. I guess the same way probably as Christians. I'm a Christian. The same way we believe that in heaven you're not really having sex anymore, right? But the Heaven's Gate members actually kind of mass castrated the men, right? Like, led by Marshall, also known as, he was Doe, I think. His female partner was Peep, if I recall, but essentially led the male followers into this kind of mass castration event.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's when you go home. That's when you say it's not for me.
You would think so. I think it's a gradualism. I don't know how you feel, but I think sometimes I think the cult world isn't the way people think it is. It isn't necessarily people brainwashed and, you know, although there's certainly those type of influences. There's people who are seeking some type of truth, and then often they move, as sociologists have taught us and anthropologists have taught us, they move between different organizations until they find one that resonates with them. But then when they're there, I think you're right. I think that eventually you buy in so much. Can you, I don't know if you can walk away, you know? I think some people did, but I think when that becomes your social reality, I mean, we can only look at mass social psychoses. We won't go into any details because it's not a political show, but we can see today how people follow what they're told just because it's the social norm. And I think when you're in a smaller control group where there's no outside debate, where there's no outside influence, if the leader of that organization says, well, you know, to get to the next level, it's time for the castration. And I think they all flew down to, like, they flew into Central. A lot of them went down to South America or Central America or somewhere, I think, to get the procedures done. Somewhere outside of the US, if I recall.
Talking about social norms and being encouraged to follow them. So I'm an alcoholic, right? I mean, I'm a raging alcoholic. At the time of my divorce, I was pretty bad drunk. I discovered something called the Society of Creative Anachronism, which is a medieval research and reenactment group, which I joined. And I'm a big King Arthur fan, right? So I got the idea with the SCA, right? I picked up fighting because at the time, 20-some years ago, I was in much better physical shape than I am today, right? I found a lot of fun. But because they upheld the standards, high standards of, say, the higher Middle Ages, high Arthurian tales, right? I could use that to quit drinking because I wanted to be accepted by people who I thought had a higher standard of living that I wanted to be like, and I wanted them to like me more. I was able to walk away from drinking. The day I decided I would drink no more was, God, it was 3 years ago. I was not a drop since, all because of that group.
Well, that goes to show that there can be benefit in joining some organizations. And I'm sure there are some people who've joined even some of the organizations we're talking about that seem oddball, that it's helped them because they found, you know, some type of sense of community or some type of acceptance. Or
but sense of belonging is everything. If you read a book, if I have recommend called Journey Down the Moon, the author talks about her experiences talking to Satanists, and she mentions a young man that she meets in the organization. When she first meets him, is very shy, hesitant to talk to people. And a couple of months after he's in joining, he's just like everybody else, talkative, whole 9 yards, because he's able to find members he can talk to, members that appreciate him, stuff like that. It's interesting stuff, say the least.
You know, sociologically, I wonder if we're obviously more interested in talking about occult type organizations and UFO cults and the like tonight. But I wonder if the same benefits can literally be found, as I mentioned before, about from joining an amateur musical society. You know what I mean? Or joining a local church or joining a karate club or something. I wonder if when you become part of something, as long as it's a place where you feel supported and you feel acknowledged. Perhaps sometimes the I don't want to say dangers, but the difficulties presented by stranger organizations is maybe this is the first taste somebody's had of acceptance.
I have to tell you, so I quit drinking. I had 2-3 years in an organization. I'm at the big thing they developed Pennsylvania called Penzic. I'm going through my divorces over with. I'm having problems with the child support, getting to see my kids and stuff. And the king of the Middle Kingdom, which is a huge part of the country, takes me by the shoulder, walks me to a private place, and lets me talk to him about my problems with my ex-wife for an hour and a half, right? So I have someone to talk to. He gives me actionable advice. He didn't have to do that.
That's like, and I know your background's Catholicism. That's kind of like going and doing, I mean, I'm not a Catholic, but I assume that's like confessional, right?
Like the idea of someone of such prestige, someone I had ultimate respect for, would take the time to talk to me. At that time, I saw myself pretty much as a worthless junk. Made a lot to me. And I wanted to make sure I followed all the things I needed to follow to make sure I upheld my honor with him. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand. I think all of these things, and this is the difficulty sometimes in approaching UFO groups or approaching our understanding of science and why it fails. Things like the UFO phenomenon. It's the same as the organization you were talking about, which sounds weird, but it's true. There are structures sociologically, and they do certain things, and we can't expect them to do things outside of their sociological structure. So it makes perfect sense. That structure was to form a sense of community, and the person who was the king, as you mentioned, understood and was probably a very good king of that organization because he understood the social structure. It was to have the people who were involved feel that they were part of it. So he took you aside, and
it's very, very important. I mean,
it's very true.
Going back to cults, if they want to join whatever and do whatever that cult wants them to do, and they all want to believe that the leader is talking UFOs or aliens from another planet, and whatever, that's fine. As long as it's not hurting anybody, as long as it's not made to do weird things, more power to them, right?
Yeah, no, I get it.
Question of why are those people selected to be the head of it? What kind of experiences are they having with the entity that gets them to believe that they've been selected to be talked to by the aliens from Venus or Mars or Krypton 14? That's the interesting part of it. And the more interesting then gets down the rabbit hole that we first started talking about is why does the government want to screw with these people? Why does the government go out of their way to screw with people when they go and research UFOs? I mean, the odds are I see a light in the sky is most likely an airplane, right? But for some reason, does it act like an airplane? I will look into that thing. Why would the government take the time of day to screw with me? It doesn't make any sense. But yet, in my opinion, they are, which is the subject of my second book.
Well, tell us a little bit more about that before we close out. So I know you were talking about it when I had my technical hitch before. But what's the motive to write the new one? Like just because
the new one is looking to using Murray Island as the focus point. Is what happened there? Some of the people involved, what their influences within the UFO community happened with them before and after Murray Island. What weird things might have happened to them and why. And why is it that so many early researchers within UFO phenomena seem to have gotten screwed with a lot by Men in Black?
That sounds fascinating. Just
Weird.
Fascinating.
I mean, even the little bit we've done, research goes on, is I know I talked to you about this a couple of times. What we think are facts, we locate one thing, you dismiss, which is important to make sure we have our facts right. And even getting the facts right, you can't necessarily trust government documents, which makes no sense to me, but hey.
And when can we expect this book? When do you plan this to drop?
Well, for my Christmas.
Okay. Good idea. Get it out so people can get it for other people as a gift. In the meantime, how do people get your UFO cults? Watch the skies.
All my books by going to Amazon and Googling. I enter my name at search bar. Call under my name Wayne Clingman. That'd be Wayne. Last name spelled Clingman. I probably have 15. No, not quite that many. Let's say good 12 books out so they can get everything from the Mafia, How to Gamble. Yay, go us, right? And we got more books coming out. We have a book coming out on the Vegas Skim that will be out probably in September. Busy buying.
Nice.
I
don't know how you have the time to write all these books, but more power to you, man. I'm still struggling with what I'm writing at the moment. But
one thing I have to realize I have to do a better job is when it comes to the final days to make sure I get my ducks are lined up in a row. As you pointed out, thank you very much for saving my ass.
Oh, it's all good, man. So good. I just think it's great that you have so many coming out. And let's get you back on along with your co-author when the next book drops around Christmas. I look forward to
that. Just to be about my co-author, Doug is interested in UFOs, but he's using his share of the book profit to do a short film. A very short 5-minute film. He won't be able to do it this year because he's runs a economic consulting group in the state of Indiana, and they were doing some branding, so it's time this year to suck off. But it's a little cute 5-minute, maybe might be 5 minutes of the film. Be a laugh right. We apologize we can't make it for Midwest Word Fest this year, but it is what it is.
Well, there's always the following here. Well, mate, it was lovely talking to you, as it always is. I'm looking forward to the upcoming book, and until we chat to you next time, keep it weird.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Until then, stay safe and keep it weird.